I mentioned earlier that when we had the public rollout for the Maryland, for the commission in 2019, there were three people who spoke there, and one of them is about to speak right now. That, in addition to Cheryl and Eiffel and the delegate. The way I came to know Dr. Kelebogile Zvobgo, that's the only time I'm going to even attempt to say that, was she had an article published in, I don't know if some of you have seen that online journal, it's called The Conversation. It's really pretty good. And she had written an article that I happened to see there that was called that the Maryland created a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for lynchings. Can it deliver? And it was a prescient, I think, analysis of some of the issues that it faces. So she wasn't a doctor then, but now she comes back and she's a doctor, which we congratulate her. And she is the founder and director of the International Justice Lab at William & Mary. And she's going to talk about a study that she just published in the International Journal of Transitional Justice, is that it? And that attempts to measure how attitudes of the state's black residents towards certain justice remedies are influenced by their knowledge of historical violence. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. And so, just that's all we need.
Hello, thank you all for having me again. It's really a pleasure. I feel like, we've been moving at warp speed because that was 2019. I was finishing up my dissertation, and I did that, and then we had a whole pandemic and an insurrection, and then I got tenure this year. So it's been breakneck speed, but I'm really delighted to be here. So this title is a little bit different than what you have in the program. I made some changes. So this is called From Racial Violence to Racial Justice. And like Will mentioned, I've been writing on transitional justice. Actually, I won't distract you with that quite yet. So when I was an undergraduate, I learned when I was studying abroad in France about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And I was really intrigued by them. So I came back for my senior year of college, and I told my advisor I have some ideas for my thesis. There's something interesting about European integration. There's some interesting stuff in the Francophone African space. But I also learned about these things called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And she hands me a book called Unspeakable Truths by Priscilla Hayner. If you haven't read it, please do. It's phenomenal. So it is the most comprehensive treatment of truth commissions around the world. She didn't tell me at the time, and I only realized years and years and years later when I was trying to interview the author, Priscilla Hayner, who's a practitioner, and supported the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, that Priscilla is Heather Williams, my advisor's cousin. And I was like, that's a big detail you didn't mention. Anyway, and so I wrote my thesis on truth commissions, in particular, how to induce the participation of perpetrators. So the existing literature does a lot on how to facilitate the participation of survivors and victims' families. And I distinguish those two, so victims who are no longer with us because they've suffered state repression. And so I wrote my thesis looking at different design features of truth commissions. Do they have subpoena powers, right? Do they have amnesty powers? So are they able to exchange amnesty for a full and truthful accounting of what has happened in the past? And then also, what is the religious and spiritual framework around the commission, if that's resonant in a particular context? And then also, did both sides basically of a conflict agree to create this body? Anyways, so I studied truth commissions. I know a lot of people in this room know about the one here in Maryland, but just as background, a truth commission is a government-sponsored body designed, and it's temporary, to investigate events in the past, to establish a pattern of harm over a period of time, and to do all of this while engaging with the affected community. And so I went to grad school for my Ph.D. and my dissertation, which will be coming out in a book next year with Oxford University Press, examines, thank you, examines truth commissions around the world, in particular, what explains why they're adopted in some places and not in others. So I look at everywhere that's had a political transition since 1970, so post-conflict, post-authoritarian, et cetera. Why they're designed with stronger powers in some places than in others, and why in some places do we see better implementation of their recommendations, and we don't in others. So this is what I was working on, and then 2019, this legislation is passed in Maryland, this Truth Commission's created, and I'm like, this is really interesting. This is the first Truth Commission to be adopted while I'm in graduate school in the US, but it's part of a broader context, right? And so I write the piece, I come to the launch of the commission. That was a really special evening, and then keep writing my dissertation. The pandemic happens, we're stuck at home. I specialize in international relations, so human rights, post-conflict justice, international law, and courts. And international relations that summer is kind of having some existential ennui, because we're like, we're academics, so we're stuck at home, it's the summer, we don't have students anymore. How are we meaningfully contributing to the world, right? As this pandemic is raging, and also as we're having this reawakening on race. And as an international relations scholar, but who's based in the US, I was trying to think, what can my work say to the present moment? And I was like, well, I studied transitional justice in those other countries, and it's happening in this country. And I've talked to my colleagues who do American politics, local politics, right? Federalism. Hey, this thing that I study over there is happening here. You should take a look at that. And they're like, oh, that's kind of weird. Don't know how to make quite sense of it. And so that summer, I decided that part of my contribution would be to more meaningfully integrate the US as a case in my study of global transitional justice. And out of this project came Democratizing Truth, an analysis of truth commissions in the United States. Feel free to email me. I can send you a copy, or I can also send a copy to Will for that to be distributed more broadly. And this is the first publication in the International Journal of Transitional Justice. So in this article, this peer-reviewed article, my student at the time, Daniel Posthumus, and I document 20 past, present, and proposed truth commissions in the United States. Because our concern for Maryland, and anywhere that's starting one of these processes, is that there's gonna be some reinventing of the wheel, right? Or drawing lessons from maybe contexts that are actually far removed. So I find often in the US context, there is this, let's talk about South Africa, because they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm like, you don't have to go that far. It's 15 hours to Johannesburg. Right here, in 1980 to 1983, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians conducted a truth commission created by Congress. And what came out of that? A report with findings establishing that persons of Japanese ancestry did not do anything to sabotage the United States during World War II, no espionage, none of that nonsense. And it came out with recommendations about apologies, reparations, reforms to educational curricula, et cetera. And even at the state level, Maine had a truth commission looking at the removal of Wabanaki children from their families and communities and their placement at an order of magnitude higher than any other group into the foster care system, and into coerced adoptions, so on and so forth. And so we wanted to, I guess, create an intellectual framework for truth commissions in the United States to kind of map out what exactly is happening here. So what are these commissions investigating? What periods of time, who creates them, to what extent is civil society involved, to what extent are international experts involved in the design operation, et cetera. And so that was kind of like a first contribution. But of course, and Maryland is one of the ongoing commissions that is in our data set, and that is publicly available through the Harvard Dataverse. And so to kind of link these in the developing research agenda, we wanted to see about, there we go. We wanted to see, okay, So truth commissions are being established in lots of different parts of the US. And the presumption, or the hope, right, is that they will support reconciliation. And if you were at the public launch back in 2019 of the Truth Commission, you would remember, or maybe you'd have heard, you might not remember, that's okay, it's a whole pandemic ago, that I said, can we not just content ourselves with the truth, right? Because forefronting reconciliation says, I already know where I want to go. And so I really like the truth first aspect of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, truth first. It is absolutely a prerequisite to reconciliation, but we might not get there, and it might not be for us. So some of my interlocutors from Canada who are Métis or Indigenous, there's this notion of the 7th generation promise. So that what we might be doing today is not for us, and we might not see it, but that it may transform through to the 7th generation. Anyways, so my colleagues, so Jamil Scott, she's a professor at Georgetown. She's from PG County. Daniel Solomon, who is also at Georgetown, was a grad student but just finished his Ph.D. We designed a survey experiment in particular, to understand attitudes towards justice in Maryland. And our sample was 800 African American residents of Maryland from across the state. And we did this survey in partnership with Emerson College. So we wanted to see if you tell people about historical violence, and then you ask them about different types of remedies, material and symbolic. So on the material side, direct financial assistance to families, and community development projects. And then on the symbolic side, apologies and memorial markers. How would they respond to that? And as our contrast, was contemporary forms of violence, in particular police killings, right? And so do people want different types of justice for historical abuses as compared to contemporary abuses? And this is just for Black Americans in Maryland. And really the top line finding is that with the exception of markers, so markers were much more preferred for people who were in the historical violence condition in the experiment. With the exception of markers, all of these remedies are desired by African Americans in Maryland. And so as just kind of like some evidence for policymakers, for civil society, that there's an interest in apologies from the state, right, for actions and inaction, for both violence in the past and violence in the present, and also for these more material forms of justice, right? So direct financial assistance to families of victims of police killings and lynchings, and then also some type of community programs. And one thing that actually came up in our open responses quite a lot was something to do with education that came up so many times. And that wasn't one of our outcomes of interest. It's not a typical output of a transitional justice process, although it certainly can be recommended by commissions, and that might be something the Commission in Maryland wants to do, is to make very specific recommendations tied to specific actors. So we want the Department of Education to do X. We think that all public schools in 11th grade or whatever grade should come to the Lewis Museum to see the exhibit on lynchings or X, so on and so forth. Anyway, so this summarizes those two studies. I have some other slides in here that I'm going to go through just super quickly to explore this research. Pardon? Yes, I'm going to in a second. To say, okay, so we learned something about Black public opinion in Maryland about these different justice options, right? But what about white people? This is political scientist. I was like, but what about the white people? And I'm like, all right, hold your horses. Right? And it's like, sometimes studies can just be about Black people. It's really fine. You lost nothing in this exercise. But there is, so, you know, in politics we talk about you need to have compliance constituencies, right? So you need a broader population to be supportive of a public policy idea in order for state actors to be interested in realizing it, right? So we have to, you know, address the white people also. I'm only laughing because you're laughing. This is This is a little bit uncomfortable. Okay. And also not just in Maryland, but across the country, right? Anyways, all right, now we're moving. And so our motivation for this research that we are extending, right, is looking at, the long civil rights movement, right? So connecting what happened in 2020 and the racial justice movement and the Black Lives Matter movement that had been going on for several years before then to the civil rights movement and even before, as we try and retrieve knowledge about the past and then mobilize action in the present. And some of these efforts, like I mentioned, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, that is part of the U.S. trying to deal with its history of racialized violence and of state repression. Gotta mention also, actually before the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, you have the National Commission on Civil Disorders, also known as the Kerner Commission, 67, 68, right? And if you read the report, its findings and its recommendations, you could just copy paste and do it today. It wasn't implemented then. Same things, more diverse police forces, an emphasis on safety rather than security, education, employment, access, so on and so forth. And so these are kind of some historical examples on the truth-seeking side. But then, of course, we have the memorialization side, as people have mentioned, so I can skip through this, including, in terms of lynching, this is the death certificate of George Armwood. And we have, again, like I said, this renewed interest in addressing racial violence through racial justice in a serious way. But of course, there is resistance that is encouraged, sponsored by the state. I just realized I don't have my tiki torch guys there too, but these are interlocked systems. You have the private sphere and the public sphere converging to enact violence. And so the idea of our project is to really see, if we tell people on a national level, right, when we put them in different conditions, how are they do we really believe no justice, no peace? And if we tell people about past violence and contemporary violence, are they moved to support redress? And this image is on the program. A man was lynched yesterday, which the NAACP would hang in its office whenever there was a report of a lynching to kind of keep that at the front of the public consciousness. And I think this is 2016, an artist called Dred Scott. It's a portmanteau. Has this one, a man was lynched by police yesterday. And so when we connect past and present, not just give people information on historical violence, period, or give people information on contemporary violence, period, that's what our first study did. When you draw the connection between past and present, does that help people along? Is that the thing that's gonna be persuasive or motivating for them to support these different policies? Let's see. So the argument basically is that the frame, right? So a frame about historical violence, a frame about contemporary violence, that these will shape people's attitudes to increase their support for justice. And we expected that the effect would be strongest if you connect past and present, so they're not so divorced. I'll skip over these hypotheses, but they basically say exactly what I just said. So we conducted a survey in 2023 to a sample of roughly 2,000 people, and we were able to work with a survey firm called Lucid and get a boost sample. So we have 805 Black respondents, about 1,200 white respondents. It's typically hard to recruit that many Black respondents, but that was really important for the design and for us to have meaningful outcomes or inferences to draw from the data. And the outcomes are support for transitional justice. And so, like I said before, symbolic material, apologies and plaques, and then financial assistance to families and community projects. We have some covariates, that just means variables that we include in our models to make sure that the correlations we observe are not spurious, but are real. So we control for race, partisanship, etc. We consider also people's historical knowledge, so we have some questions to kind of gauge how much they already knew going into our survey, and then some political attitudes and experiences variables, including linked fate. So I believe what happens to me affects my group and vice versa. We asked that of the Black respondents, and also we ask a question about racial resentment, which is basically a set of questions that measure anti-Black attitudes, and some others. Okay, so I explained these conditions to you. So we had 500 people, roughly, in each of the conditions. One is the control, so we just tell people about the increasing use of social media in the US. Nothing to do with racial violence. We're not trying to prime people. We have our condition 2, which is about the history of lynchings of Black Americans in the US, the policing condition, and then both. Okay, so this is symbolic justice. Ooh, this came out kind of small in here. Anyways, so on the far left is the control group. So we have about 65% who support one of the 2 forms of symbolic justice. Both, that's the continuities frame. And then we have the lynching frame and the policing frame. The main thing you have to know from this graph is that these whiskers, they all overlap. So regardless of the condition that people are in, statistically, the attitudes are the same. So me giving someone information about past violence or about contemporary violence or even both is not moving the needle relative to the folks who just read something about social media use, which is like, wow, we were not able to move people to support forms of symbolic justice for past or present abuses. And this is a Black and white sample. Okay, what about material justice? Whoops, I went too far. And, oh yes, and then, sorry, then we split it by racial group for symbolic justice. And at the bottom here is the white respondents. At the top there is the Black respondents. So you'll see a similar pattern that is more information is not moving people, but the very clearly driving variable, because we have 0 overlap, right, in the confidence intervals, that's what they're called, between Black respondents and white respondents. And I raised this not to be a Debbie Downer, although I guess I was that at the other thing as well. Like, does it have to be a reconciliation? I don't know if we're here. I don't know if the data support that we are there yet. Now, the point of the work is to get us closer to converging on our understanding of the past, and most importantly, our duty in the present to redress it. Yeah? Okay. Material justice, similar thing. One interesting thing is people kind of get compensation and family, that is direct financial assistance to families, and community projects in the policing condition only. But still, you'll see for the lynching treatment, no, not different from the control condition. And what's interesting too, if you really think about it, the people who got both, it means that bringing up the historical piece actually brought them back to their, essentially, statistically, like they're not distinguishable from the control groups. It's as if we had given them no information or they reverted back to their opinion. It's not the same people, but this is what we're modeling here. So it's like policing seems to be more tangible, and that could be the political environment that we are conducting this in, but also excavating the past is really hard. And people are like, well, if we just open up the can on the past, then like, well, you know, like our colleague who's talking about like East Towson, it's like that descendant population is still very much there. And so when you open up acknowledgement, that potentially opens up liability, and institutions sometimes don't want to do that. So anyway, we just found that finding to be really interesting, both that the policing condition does increase support for material justice, but that the tie-in to the past can actually have a depressing effect. Okay. Same thing by racial group, same pictures before. It's actually a different picture, I promise. The estimates are slightly different, but it's a similar pattern, but not a similar pattern. This is so interesting, and we're gonna run more and more studies to be able to validate that this is a consistent, stable result. 2,000 people, 1,000 in each group. But the people who are moved in the policing condition, it's really the white population. So something about having to see, and this might be a post-2020 thing, right, of having to see in our communities, in our current environment, Black people being killed by police, often, most of the time with impunity, that seems to increase support for material justice. And we still have, the comments and other things to work through, but these are just some preliminary findings. I'm almost done, Will, don't get nervous. He'd given me a lot of time before today, and then this happened. All right, so what are we seeing here? This is Black linked fate. So in the gray above, it's gonna be Black people who think that things that happen to my group matter to me. That's what linked fate is, developed by Michael Dawson in his 1994 book, Behind the Mule. Okay, so what does this see? So Black people who express linked fate are likely to support at an even higher level than those who don't, support for symbolic measures. So it's almost like, and this is kind of the story they're trying to tell, is symbolic efforts to respond to the apologies and memorialization of violence that happened to people that may not even be in my direct community or in my family, that still matters to me, and I want that acknowledged because there's a link to me. There's an educative function, a social function that apologies memorials play, that even if I'm not directly affected, I will be indirectly affected by this method of transitional justice. And we thought that was a pretty powerful result. They overlap in the policing condition. So whether you feel very strongly that what happens to your group affects you, whether you feel that or you don't, there is similar levels of support for symbolic measures. And then for the material measures, again, Black folks expressing high linked fate, more likely to, or support at a higher level. Already super high. Remember those last graphs? Those were all like in the 70s and 80s, right? So this is just about differences in kind, not differences in type. Last one, second to last one, penultimate. All right, so this is about white racial resentment. So as people express anti-Black attitudes, and we capture them through a series of questions, it has an even, this is, I think, the big ball game. I showed you the picture that was like, it's a racial thing, right? But it's also an interracial thing, it's an intraracial thing as well. So people asked about, action points to the panel earlier, like white folks in the room. There is something about talking to your friends, your neighbors, your family members about updating their racial attitudes. And you don't got to do all of them, but it's decreasing prejudices that actually has a material impact on support for justice measures, right? So having anti-Black attitudes means you are that much farther from wanting redress for anti-Black violence, which is chilling. And so we find very similar patterns, and it seems to be the white folks who don't express racial resentment who are most supportive of material justice for policing violence, and that difference between that group and the control condition is the only statistically significant difference. And so that's powerful, that's encouraging. All right, so some avenues for future research, I'm happy to talk about this, is to think about the effects of historical violence other than lynching, right? So I remember being puzzled a little bit when I heard about this commission in Maryland that was gonna focus on lynching. Because often in the countries that I study around the world, it is about investigating gross human rights violations and the limitation is on the period of time that is studied, not so much focusing on one type of abuse. That's like an older school approach to truth commission. So in Argentina, there was a national commission on disappeared persons, right? In Chile in '93, there was a national commission on disappeared persons. They did a do-over later in 2003. They're like, we've got to talk about political prisoners and those who were tortured. Anyways, so focusing on one type of violence against one type of community is different from global practice. Not necessarily bad, but it's just different, right? In that the mandate is so constrained. But strategically in a US context, like lynchings are objectionable, like, and obviously so, in a way that maybe talking about the past can start to help us talk about the present, right? Alternate policy outcomes besides the ones that we talked about, so apologies, plaques, direct financial assistance to families, and also to these development projects. And yeah, we have these counterintuitive effects of policing frames based on racial resentment, which is interesting for us. I think the formatting got a little messed up. Anyway, that's us on Twitter. Those are our websites. Definitely, I will send Will. Will already has the second paper, so the lynching, the Maryland paper. He has that, but I'll send him the one on U.S. truth commissions in general. My team of students in the International Justice Lab is also collecting. We've been collecting data since 2021 when this article was published about additional efforts to do truth commissions in the U.S. And, there's proposal in North Dakota, South Dakota, Mississippi, California, and in different cities. Now, whether or not those proposals will materialize into policy is a question. In Minneapolis, it took 4 years. The place where George Floyd was killed, it took 4 years for the task force to materialize into a truth commission. That just started this summer, late summer, early fall. So anyway, I shaved off 10 minutes from what I had been asked to give. So I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It sounds as if you were saying that apologies are healing in some ways. And I'm wondering, given the apology that Congress issued in 2007, what's your take on how effective that was and to what extent was it healing for this country?
Thank you for the question. Okay, so there's like my intuitive answer, then there's my political science answer. Okay, so the question was basically, what is the effect of apologies? So here we're looking at support for apologies, right? And the question is like, what is the effect of apologies on communities, right? So my political science answer would be, I would want to look at either the CCES, which is an annual politics and social attitudes question, or a survey, or the ANES, which is the American National Elections survey, and basically, like, I would want to look at relevant questions before and after 2007. That's my political science answer. But in general, so we're talking about the truth pillar of transitional justice, right? That's why we have a truth commission, we have memorialization. But transitional justice is 4 pillars: truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition, right? Which we've operationalized to mean institutional reforms. And transitional justice is not just to help us out of a particular political moment into the next one. Of course, that is one big part of it, but it is about changing the relationship between the state and perpetrator groups and survivors and victims' families, right? And so if we develop new habits, like when we do bad things, we acknowledge them and we seek to create a record of them, that we are able to provide justice. Now, justice is a little bit easier for contemporary violence because there's still witnesses around, there's still perpetrators. The people, most perpetrators of lynchings, right, are not with us anymore. And then the reparation piece, right, whether it's symbolic or material, and the reform piece. And so when you conduct transitional justice, it's also changing how you will be in the future, right? If we internalize the norm of redress for harm, and we set up institutions in place to not perpetuate harm or to perpetrate harm in the future, then we don't have repetition, right? And so I think that if we embrace these norms and implement them and follow up on them, that we will all be transformed, right? But recognition is such an important piece. Apology is such an important piece. So scientifically, I don't know to say the effect of that particular apology, but in terms of embracing a new modus operandi, that can be really powerful. Yeah, other questions? Yes?
I have a question, because you talked a little bit about the Wabanaki. What was the relationship between the Indian Land Dales and the Wabanaki Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
Pardon, sorry?
There were Indian Land Dales particularly in northern Maine.
Yes.
And was that a result of, or did those two things happen independently?
To my knowledge, those were separate. So
Okay,
so not even all of them, but 5 Wabanaki tribes and the government created this commission to understand basically child welfare policy when it came to indigenous peoples, indigenous children very specifically. So that was also one type of abuse, right, or one system of abuse, and one particular set of victims, Thank you. Yes?
I'm curious if any of the data could be disaggregated by age, because there's a part of me that believes that older people care about apology. I'm almost certain that if you had 800 Gen Zs in a room, they could give less than a you-know-what about an apology. They want action.
Yeah.
They want things to change.
Yeah.
They want economic justice. So can the data be disaggregated at all?
So we definitely, we have age data. I know for the Maryland survey, that was a smaller population, 800 people, and then you divide that across the 2 conditions, 4 and 4. We did not detect cohort effects in terms of age. But then you're asking Black people, so like maybe if you're 20, like my college students, and they've been socialized through their families, that they might have. So I would actually expect more of the variation by age groups potentially for the white for the white population, but not necessarily for the Black one. At least just based on Maryland. Now you look nationwide, you might have a lot more variation. Also interesting, we asked people in the Maryland survey like how long their family's been in Maryland, and generations in Maryland. That was not a predictor of extra support. So it just speaks to that this is something that is held more widely by the Maryland community, even if you're a first-generation Marylander. As long as you're Black, your attitudes, your answers to the questions look very similar to someone who's second, third, and seventh. I know there's people in the room who are from Maryland. Cool. Thank you.
So a few years ago, I was invited to take part in an audience talk back at Silver Spring Stage following a performance of a play called Appropriate, or Appropriate, depending on if you're using the verb or the adjective. And many of you have probably heard of it. It's say again? All right. So, it deals with a situation not unlike what was presented in My Father's Name. There's a family reunion at their old plantation home in Arkansas. 3 siblings who are emotionally challenged to begin with, I think, before they walked into the room. And they discover in the course of going through their father's belongings, their recently deceased father's belongings, they discover a scrapbook filled with pictures of lynchings. And then there are other items that convince them that their father, who was a judge, I believe, was involved in these murders. It was revived on Broadway this past spring, And it won 3 Tony Awards, including one for the playwright who we're about to meet, Branden Jacobs-Jenkins. He is from the D.C. area, I think. And one of our colleagues from the Montgomery County Coalition, Dinaba Ashabir, was very generous and suggested that we try to reach him to see if he might want to speak here, given the nature of the subject matter. And I'm thrilled. It was something that I never would have had the nerve to have tried, and I appreciate that you did, and it worked out. So, and so he's going to join us in a minute to talk about his play and how racial terror is, portrayed in the play and in the stage in general. And then joining him, we're thrilled to welcome as well Stevie Walker-Webb, who is in, I think, his 13th month as the artistic director of Baltimore's Center Stage. Mr. Walker-Webb won an Obie Award in 2019 for his direction of Ain't No Mo at the Public Theater, recently nominated for a Tony Award for directing the play's Broadway production. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome them onto the stage to talk about it.
There we go. Want to make sure y'all are still awake. When I say yes, you say no. Yes, yes, yes. No, no, no. When I say up, you say down. Up, up, up. Up, down, no. See, y'all, we're going to have to wake up. We're going to have a good conversation. I'm just going to get this out of the way really quickly. It is such an honor. Thank you so much, Will, for having us both, but it's really an honor to sit next to you. I've had the pleasure of working with some of the greatest playwrights of my generation. I haven't worked with this one yet. I'm twisting his arm already. But you are one of my favorite playwrights, man, like living or dead. I met your work through Neighbors, and then I saw an Octoroon too many times in New York City when it was up there, and Appropriate or Appropriate, I saw that. I just love your work, the way that you write, illuminating our past and giving us an ability to look at our history with just enough veneer for us to be honest about it is special. It is unique. You are a national treasure. And so I just had to get my little fanboy moment out the way. Thank you for sitting with me.
Thank you, Stevie. I just want to say how honored I am. When they asked me to do this, the first person I asked for was Stevie, because I don't think Baltimore understands who walked. This is a young legend here. And yes, very happy to be on stage with you. And very happy to just see you bringing your gifts and power to this. My father actually is from Baltimore, and I grew up with all the stories he told me about seeing every August Wilson play that came through at Baltimore Center Stage, and this is a very special. I grew up in D.C. I grew up in Tacoma, D.C. So just right over the border. So it's just I'm so happy to be here to speak to this and to speak with you and to just share a little space with everybody on Saturday. Thank you, guys.
So let's get into it. Like I said, I've seen the play. I've read it quite a few times. I'm like, when can I program it at Center Stage? How many of you, just show of hands so we know who we're talking to, how many of you have been able to actually see this work? Oh, great. We've got a little family in the room. We got a little bit. So just to catch everybody up, Branden, can you talk to us about what is the play? Give us just a kind of synopsis of the plot and maybe some of the themes in the play.
It's sort of written kind of self-consciously in the vein of like the great American family drama. So it is a family drama. It's set in an unnamed town in southeast Arkansas, and it concerns 3 very adult siblings who kind of descend on this homestead to basically divide and liquidate their father's estate. And what they learn, and so we have some folks who've absconded to the Pacific Northwest. We have an oldest son who lives as a magazine editor in New York, and then there's this daughter, Tony, who lives in Atlanta, but they all grew up in D.C., and what we learn is that this house was a kind of ancestral space that the father, after the death of his wife and their mother, decided to move back to and refurbish, as many people were doing with these plantation homes kind of at the turn of the century when there was government money interested in that. And among the many things they discover as they kind of sort through this hoarded mass of life's clutter, one of the first things they find is a very ample photograph album filled with lynching photographs and postcards and such like. And there's a kind of initial explosion as they try to understand the provenance of these objects. But of course, some more things resurface over the course of the play, and hilarity ensues, as they say. Yeah.
Now, one of the moments in the script and the production that I'll never forget is it's kind of later in the play. There's so much arguing going on back and forth about what to do with these images, whether or not they should be destroyed or whether or not they should be thrown out. And the home, this mansion, this plantation property, it's like it's either the back taxes, something has happened, and they're like $500,000 in debt. And so while they're going back and forth around the moral question of what to do with these images, it becomes apparent that there is a market for these images. And so now the conversation becomes a capitalistic one, right? This thing of like, do we pay off the debt for this by selling these images to people who are interested in collecting these things? And so this huge argument is happening, and then a fight ensues. It's like this, it erupts into like actual familial violence, which is, I have to say, was satisfying to watch. I was like, okay, my family's not the craziest people on the block. But so it erupts, and there's this moment. Is it Ainsley? Is that the youngest
kid?
kid?
To spoil the play.
Well, oh crap!
It's okay. It's okay. No one's gonna see this play. No one's gonna read my play.
You can. It's that good though.
That was a joke. You will after this conversation.
But so there's a moment where the youngest character in the play. How old is he?
He's like, I think he's ready to be like 8 or 9 years old.
He's standing at the top of the stairs with, he's found a Ku Klux Klan hood in his grandfather's closet because they're cleaning out the estate, and he finds it there. And so while the family is all of these spiritual, moral, financial arguments that have erupted into physical altercation, while they're fighting about literally their familial history, this 8-year-old is standing at the top of the stairs with his hood on, and he has no clue of its historical impact. And it is that image, that is that moment that kind of brings everyone's feet to the floor again. So let me ask you, where in the world did this play come from in you? The thing that I think is so interesting is that Branden, he writes about the racial plight and the racial legacy and the reverberation of our country in so many interesting ways. And all of the plays that I cited, go read An Octoroon, go buy a copy of it. Go read Neighbors, go buy a copy of it. Buy a copy of this play. But in all of those other plays, you have black and white characters. But in this play specifically, you have all white characters. So my question is kind of twofold. One, where did it come from in you? And two, what made you decide to remove all of the black characters from the narrative?
Where didn't it come from? I think like most artists would agree, there's very rarely ever like a source. There's usually like 4 or 5 threads in your life that kind of come together one day, and you go, oh my God, this is an idea. And I would say among those ideas was definitely growing up with 2 parents who were black memorabilia collectors. This was like a tremendous fad, I guess, amongst specifically the black middle class in the 70s and 80s. And it was, my parents both grew up in Jim Crow South. I'm actually, Maryland is the South, but my father grew up here, had moved with his family from North Carolina. His father worked at Bethlehem Steel. And my mother had grown up in Camden, Arkansas, which is like the other end of the Deep South. And they both, for whatever reason, kind of around our age, they literally met at an antique auction for this stuff. So I grew up around these images in a way that was quite normalized and sort of without context. And of course, when I began to bring friends over in high school, they would come to my house and be like, "What is happening?" And I'm like, "Oh, right, this is this colored only sign's kind of ironic, you know." But I do remember having conversations with them. Once I began to kind of wrap my head around why it made my friends uncomfortable, becoming very fascinated by their desire to collect this stuff and memorialize it. And I think there was always this idea of having to snatch something back from oblivion, right? It was a thing that the world was ready to be ashamed of and hide. And they thought, no, I want to hold it because I think there's meaning in holding on to it. And I remember my father saying all the time, you know, that one of the hardest things to procure in the market, there was always a sub-market to the market. And one of those things was lynching photographs. And he was like, in all my time, I've seen a handful at these conferences, but I know they're out there. And that was always an interesting idea in my mind. And similarly, I was interested in writing about, I'd written a play called Neighbors, which you brought up, which is in some ways the antithesis of what you're saying about appropriate, which is that it was a kind of mashup of every kind of form of black representation I could think of or find in the American pop cultural imaginary. So we had characters in blackface, we had black characters, we had mixed race characters, we had like all kinds of crazy stuff going on. It was a crazy play. And got me in a lot of trouble, but I'm here now. But the response to that by honestly 100% white critics was very interesting. And there was a general sense that I was overselling a point and I didn't need to put all this in their faces. So I became interested in how to make blackness so invisible and yet it would still animate the room. There was also a need to, I mean, again, I'm not talking to the right crowd here, but there's also an argument about theater happening, right? And also kind of American theater and this idea of the family and who gets to have a family drama. So you look at something like Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun or any of the like incredible August Wilson plays, they're never categorized as family dramas. They're always told, they're always about the black experience, right? They're always kind of diminished and as if, anyway. So I was like, interesting, because when I read plays like A Long Day's Journey into Night or Death of a Salesman or Streetcar Named Desire, I see race all over it, actually. Tennessee Williams wrote more about the haunting of racial violence than I think anyone who's in that canon. So I was like, I'm gonna try to do this. And I also was very inspired by a phenomenon which isn't really talked about a lot of the lynching dramas. Maybe you know about these, but there was a very important moment sort of inspired by Ida B. Wells, but actually really triggered by W. Du Bois in the face of the propaganda that was Birth of a Nation. He was asking for, people kind of don't remember how, well, you all do, but that lynching was considered a real kind of epidemic culturally, and of course spurred what we now call the Great Migration, the racialized violence. And a woman named Angelina Grimke, who is part of the famous Grimke family, which some of you may know who they are. She wrote a play called Rachel that was what we would call now a lynching drama, anti-lynching drama. And the impulse behind this work was to challenge or expand our understandings of lynchings to be about less than one victim, but actually these lynchings wind up affecting entire families. So it was important, kind of almost unspoken rule in this work was to never show the lynching, but only to show, never to reconstruct the violence, but to show its impact. So these plays were often set in homes, they centered on women, and her play Rachel is probably the most important of the three, but a woman named Georgia Douglas, I'm forgetting her middle name, another woman named Alice Dunbar Nelson, who is married to Paul Laurence Dunbar. They were all, by the way, based in D.C., which people don't talk about that there is a real important cultural and economic pipeline between Washington, D.C. and the Harlem Renaissance happening at the same time. But there was this kind of explosion of black plays by women about lynching that took place in domestic spaces. And I thought, what's our version of that now? How do we kind of think about the racialized violence as living beyond, living through history, right? And I wanted to kind of look at perpetuators. I'm thinking there's so many, let me stop talking now. But there's so many things happening. There's also a great book called Regarding the Pain of Others by Susan Sontag, the book is mostly about war photography, but actually the one exception is she talks about a very important exhibit called Without Sanctuary. It all circles back now. Without Sanctuary was a major, really the first public exhibition of what to this date is known to be the largest collection of lynching photographs. and it happened kind of around 9/11, so it's been swallowed up. But it was a tremendous trigger point because many people didn't know this existed. It was a big deal in the antique circles that this large of a collection had existed in private and was now being made public. There's a great monograph that came, a catalog of them called Without Sanctuary, and in that anthology is a play by a cultural critic named Hilton Als, who used to be my boss. And he was putting together his first collection of essays called White Girls, and I was sitting there typing up he didn't keep any electronic copies or anything. So I just sit there and type up all of the things he'd written, and one of them was this play, GWTW, this essay called GWTW, and Without Sanctuary, and it stands for Gone with the Wind. And he's really talking about why it becomes the work of Black intellectuals to explain away or give resolution to violence that was not perpetuated by Black. Like, it's never, we're always called on to be the source of repair when actually there's nothing for us to repair. We're not the ones who were murdered, Anyway, that's like a very long-winded answer there.
I could literally just listen to you talk. I mean, it makes sense that you got the Genius Grant because it just kind of flows out. I was watching one of Toni Morrison's interviews with Bill Moyer this morning in preparation for this conversation. She's like, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and Literary Imagination. It's a text that I like. It's a mother text for me. I go back to it at least once a year. I try to read it all the way through, and it takes me about a year to read it because it feels like the Bible to me. The thesis statement that she puts forth in that book is that, by now we kind of all know about it, but the struggle that the African American writer has with the white gaze, with its that Black writers, because she was a formidable editor for years, and how she was sitting opposite some of the best writers of her time, Black writers, and she could feel them writing to the white critic over their shoulder. And so in this interview with Bill Moyer, she's talking about, she kind of sums up, I think she was talking about maybe the bluest eye, but he asked her a question about racism, and she summed up the whole kind of conversation by saying that essentially that racism is really a problem that was manufactured and created and constructed by white people, and that it is equally that their responsibility to unpack and to begin to do the rigorous work of deconstructing its effects on them, which by now in society we all kind of, this language is hopefully a part of how we understand race in this country. But when I read Appropriate, I sat there and I thought, oh my goodness, you've really taken on that thesis statement that she puts forth in a lot of her work, which is that by taking the victims of the atrocity out of the play and leaving this crazy white family in a room together to solve this $500,000 debt, it really brought that thesis statement to life. And I was like, oh my God, she would have just loved to have sat in the theater and see that thesis statement be materialized in that way. And I'm kind of like just gobsmacked by just the power of what it does. And at the end of the play, it was so funny. I saw it on Broadway. I'd read it before, and every time I read it, I won't tell you about the end of it, there is something that I just get verklempt, because there's something that you are able to illustrate so deeply about the human condition, which I like. As a true fan of your work, I was like, oh my God, you really got into the psychology of this white family to be able to render like a deeply human moment at the end of that play. And I'm kind of interested in the work that you had to do to kind of imagine or intuit the psychological neuroses. There's a character, Tony, the matriarch of the family, has this kind of position in the play where you can feel that she's terrified to look over her shoulder and see her own history. You can feel it in the play. The entire time she's talking about, like, maybe these aren't Papa's photographs. Maybe the hood is, I don't know. She has an excuse for every item that's found. and the tremulous nature of her characterization and the desperation of her brother at the end of the play. How do you get to that simple human truth without, and it's written in a way where you're not encouraging anyone to judge these characters. You just kind of objectively give us their relationships. How did you do that?
I was young. I had a lot of time on my hands. You know, what's interesting is kinship relationships aren't very different. You know, every family is what it is. And it's when that family unit interacts with socio-cultural constructs like race that texture is found and dimension is found. And I really did sort of draw on family relationships I knew or understood. You know, I tried to, you know, I think there's also something about, yeah, I'm thinking of Tony because, like, you know, the greatest advice she gives to a writer is you have to write things you want to see, you know. And I had to write a family that I would be willing to sit there and listen to, and that meant I had to care enough about them to try to understand why they were the way they were, you know. And I think that the play is ultimately also interested in how families forget, you know, how families, where, you know, we think about family trees, but every tree has a juncture, you know, and at some point in your past, somebody stopped talking to somebody, and that's why you don't know who your cousin is, you know, and that's just something real inside my family. You know, I'm familiar with shames, and I'm familiar with how when stories stop and how families talk around soft spots and events, and I just thought about this as a similar iteration of that, and that's what helped me kind of get there, I would say, you know. But there's also an allegory kind of happening about sort of regionalisms around whiteness, and how those things are tied to the literal economic and social evolution of the country, right? So thinking about the Pacific North, you know, we can kind of see it playing out some of our politics here, but there's extremely strong historical and kinship ties between the Pacific Northwest and the Deep South, and that's related to the industry of timber and how we exploited the land there. You know, if we look at this, you know, I remember I was in grad school. I had a friend, I brought this play into grad school, and one of my colleagues was like, "Oh my God, I get you now. You're like a DC writer. Like, you're not the North, but you're not the South. You're not the Black, you're not the white, but it's all political, but you don't talk about being political." And I'm like, that's actually very true, right? That every kind of pocket of our culture, you know, what it is to kind of escape to New York as this sort of liberal bastion, this media bastion, and how it requires you to kind of erase something about your origins, like that kind of all plays into the story we tell ourselves about our country, but also the differences inside of that kind of storytelling, you know. So that's part of also maybe what's going on there is, like, I think people are feeling a quieter message about populations as much as they are feeling the intimate specifics of a family, maybe. I don't know.
When you talk about the power of stories, one reason why I was really excited to be here today, I have a book coming out this coming January, called God of the Whirlwind. I grew up in Waco, Texas, which one of the most infamous images of lynching was the lynching of Jesse Washington. That happened in Waco, Texas, and it brought W.B. Du Bois down to Texas because there was so much racial unrest that was happening around his lynching. And the book, God of the Whirlwind, seeks to capture through kind of a Zora Neale Hurston-style anthropological, it's written by my dear friend Tyler B. Davis, and I kind of served as an editor and wrote the foreword for it, but spent a lot of time over the years talking with him about this image of Jesse Washington and growing up in Waco, Texas, and seeing that image, knowing that it was a part of our kind of cultural iconography, and knowing that it happened, but it not existing in any kind of formal way in our history books. That, you know, that the conversations around Jesse Washington for me didn't really materialize until I was in college, and I was living in Dallas, Texas, and all of a sudden I'm in an African American history class, and someone's actually lecturing about what happened to this young man. But this collection of essays seeks to kind of tell the story of Jesse Washington through the lens of Black people who were either alive or children, descendants of that time frame, who would have seen it. The interesting thing about it, it's called God of the Whirlwind, because so the lynching happened, and then like, I think it's like 30, 40 years to the day almost, a tornado comes through Waco and devastates the downtown sector. And at the time, Waco, Texas it was kind of positioned to become a major metroplex. It was kind of competing with Dallas, Texas at this time for its kind of economic importance on the I-35 corridor. And when the tornado came, it completely, for 2 decades, it took 2 decades for the city to kind of recover from the financial devastation of this tornado. And black people at the time said that the tornado came through the exact same route that Jesse Washington was lynched. That it tore up, because he was, hitched to a car and drug through from way out and into the center of downtown, and then he was hung in front of our the city, the courthouse. Thank you. And there are images of him burned, and the children eating sandwiches on their father's, mother's lap or shoulder. And so my grandmother, Lucille Webb, who lived to be 95 years old, she was born a sharecropper and would come to be a homeowner and someone who integrated her neighborhood, and a business owner, just a phenomenal woman. But my entire life, she would tell me the story. Anytime there was a tornado, in Texas, Tornado Alley, she would tell me the story of Jesse Washington and talk to me about, in her mind, it was kind of the divine hand of God enacting a kind of a justice for, dispossessed black people who could not find justice at that time. And I when I was, preparing for this conversation today, I thought so much about the power of story. That, Appropriate gives us a story that removes the black body, but you feel the spirit of it. You really feel those characters. Like there's a cemetery scene that's described in the play, but you feel almost like the ghost of that history haunting them. But you give us that story, and then sometimes stories are used in ways to return a kind of poetic justice to the people who have been dispossessed. And I don't know, I'm thinking so much about the importance of, when you talk about Maryland not being the North or the South, that it's somewhere in between. What y'all are doing, what we are doing here, in so many ways is the closest to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we have come in this country. And I think a lot about that when I see your work, that the theater is this place where you can put our history on stage and people have to breathe the same air and look at this story and hopefully go home and talk about it, or talk about it in the lobby during intermission and be really disturbed or challenged by it. And how there's such a need for us to have a real, our version of what a reconciliation commission would look like. For whether there's when you talk about the TRC, so much, the attempt of it, so much success, so much failure. But I marvel at a country that attempts to do that, whereas like we can't even get aligned on the telling and the retelling of these stories and looking at these stories. And so for me, I felt so empowered by reading the play and being in this conversation with you, because I've never sat on a panel in my hometown and talked about Jesse Washington, and I look forward to the day that happens, and I hope that this book is the beginning of that. But I just, again, like Will and everyone that helps to organize these conversations and everything that y'all are doing, it's so important. It's so important that we retrieve these stories, and that we find ways to give dignity and recollection to the thousands of unmarked graves that exist all over this country, both north and south, and everywhere in between. So I guess what I'm trying to find the words to say is is thank you, because I never thought I would see the day that a play like that could live on Broadway.
Me neither. I'm shocked.
All right.
Is it a Q&A? No.
I want to make sure, would anyone like to ask, you have any questions? You just kind of, go ahead, yeah.
Wonderful work, both of you. My question is for... I forgot your name, sir.
Branden.
One more time?
Branden.
Branden, did you get any backlash as a black man writing this white story, like a lot of white people get for telling black tales?
Well, not to my face. There was, what I think about is, so when the play first premiered in New York, we got a very unkind, super negative, aggressive review from a critic at New York Magazine. And it was wild. It was so wild. He called it overheated and undercooked. That was the phrase he used. And then ironically, this production on Broadway was like a bit of a revival because it was 10 years later. That same critic is the head critic at the New York Times. And he wrote a review where he took back his previous review. Yeah, it was interesting. And then he wrote another essay about why he took it back, and it was, he sort of claimed that he was a different person than he was back then, which is interesting, and I sort of put that feather in my hat. But yeah, originally I think people didn't know what to do with it. I think people were suspicious. They couldn't figure out the game. I think they were coming in expecting a tone that wasn't there, and they got something else, and it really freaked them out. But also the play, a lot of folks who saw the show, especially recently, didn't know that I was black. And that was like a whole other level to the experience for them after the fact, where they were like, what? So yeah, it's been a hilarious experience of people wrestling with their authorship question of it. But I can't complain so far, yeah.
One more.
I have the microphone.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that. I actually saw you interviewed on CBS Mornings, I think, and so I made a point of going to New York to see the play. When you're tackling these complicated stories that have to deal with race, I wonder if you've thought of how to tell those stories so younger people will hear them, see them, listen to them. They don't necessarily flock to Broadway. But I hear my students, I teach at Morgan State University, I hear my students saying they don't really want to deal with the pain of the past. They want to focus on Black joy. But they need to hear some of these stories. So I'm thinking somebody like you may find a way to do that. Are you thinking of ways to reach that younger crowd?
Gosh. Well, I will say that Appropriate, part of its success was that it was bringing first-time theater goers to the Broadway. So there was clearly, and they were younger, and they were more diverse than they ever seen, And that was heartening, that I do think there are people who are curious about these things. I feel I'm an educator myself. I'm a professor. I teach these babies. I realize I'm getting older and they're getting younger. That's a space I'm in my life right now. But I think part of what the play is arguing is that the young people don't know what they don't know, and if you don't address that with them, cycles return. You walk downstairs, it's wearing what you think is a Halloween costume, and everyone looks at you in horror, But it also is about making it, I think what a lot of young people don't ever understand how to do, they're all narcissists, so you have to make the connection between that Black joy and how it's possible because of this, right? Like why you're putting the premium on Black joy is because for so long there wasn't a representation for you in which to experience joy, right? You were not able to, like, it is incredible that we even have people of color on TV now, right? If you think about something, there's this great documentary on LeVar Burton and Reading Rainbow, which is like extraordinary. And if you think about, how what Roots was, but that he pivoted into making sure that he was also in space, but also teaching kids to read, that all these things are related. They're all interrelated. Black joy can't exist in a vacuum, right? You're not going to understand what joy is until you've felt pain, right? And then you're not going to understand how many different kinds of pain exist and the rewards of pain and how pain changes and the value of scars and, legacies and why you might feel something and not know why you feel it. It's because you don't know the context of your life. You don't know you don't know how to talk about the experience of your life. And I think my worry is that we think of drama, we think of TV, we think of things as escapism, but actually all these things should be about group experiences of story, right? That you go to the theater because it's about, I was just saying that, Baltimore Center Stage is such an important theater because it's one of the few theaters in America where I do believe there's an equal investment between Black and white constituents inside that metropolis. That doesn't happen everywhere else, right? And that actually that the people want to share that space. They want to weigh their values together. They want to feel all the feelings and rehearse all the feelings in a safe way so they can go into their life and feel more confident in how they live it, right? So, I don't know, TikTok, I don't know how to answer that question, but I do believe if you build it, they come, right? If you make it an inviting space, if you don't make it too judgmental, if you, again, show them themselves where they are and show them the connection between that and what's happened is how you... Oh, God. A trilogy. Yeah, coming to a theater near you. Commissioning my play, Black Joy.
I'm working on it, actually. I love that question because writers like Branden, for me as like a director and a producer, it's a call to action. Because the thing that I love about Baltimore Center Stage is exactly what you said. Like, first of all, our audiences really know how to watch plays. Like, they don't sit there and clap like this. They really really invest in the story. But the thing that I'm getting at is that when you have somebody who is profound and sometimes profane as you are, then my job as a director producer is to make sure that the young people and all people know that the play is happening and figuring out how to make them feel like they can come in to see it. Because I know that the play will do its job if I can get the audience in there to do their part of it. Like, they're our last scene partner. And I think for too long, the theater has become this inaccessible, stuffy space that's just not a fun place to go. But when you have someone, this is actually one of your more tamed plays. I mean, when you talk about Neighbors or an Octoroon, you are way in outer space, doing just breaking form and playing with time and the contemporary versus the classic. You're just doing all kinds of really rupturous things. And so I feel a real calling to make sure that young people know that the theater is for them. And so that when they come, then the work of the play can happen in them, And so I love that question.
Last one over here. Yeah.
This is not so much a question, but one of the reasons in our cultural traditions that we connect our ancestors and praise of our ancestors for their sacrifice is to ensure that our youngsters know Black joy also, because they have to understand we are constantly moving forward. But the other thing that both of you are doing is sort of what Nina Simone said, is that you have to be invested in the movement, in the struggle, in the education of our next generation. So I'm looking forward to the Black Joy play from both of you. And I think maybe get some young people to help infuse some ideas into that, so you can, you don't have to worry about TikTok. But I appreciate what both of you are doing to advance the thinking and the artistry of the Black community. So thank you.
Thank you guys very much. Thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Well, good afternoon, and I know I'm the last thing on the agenda, and so I know what that means. Y'all are tired. Been here all day. I've been here all day, too. But I did want to talk a little bit about how we got to what we got to. And I wanted to just start out with a couple of things. There has been a whole theme today around truth, right? And so we went into this development of this exhibit with truth as a cornerstone of what we were trying to do. The other thing is that there has been a sense throughout this day that there are a lot of bold soldiers in this room, people who have stepped out and done what they needed to do, regardless of what the other things were around them in the environment. And I think that that was the case, too, with the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project when it came to the museum and said, this is something that we really want to do. So I'm just going to quickly tell you what the process was, but I'm going to give you an analogy. Designing, developing, coming up with this exhibit was like sausage making. There's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Some of it's good for you, some of it's bad for you, but by the time you get finished mushing it all up together and it comes out in a casing, it's pretty tasty. And that is the process that I think that we went through. You know, first off, it was important to do this. I met Will not long after I actually got here to Maryland, coming from the National Civil Rights Museum. And Will was, I guess, a little familiar with my work at the National Civil Rights Museum. And there was a lynching memorial project in Memphis, Tennessee, actually. So I was pretty familiar with it. And he came to me and said they wanted to do this exhibit. And I said, okay, I think that that's something that we should do. That's what this museum is about. We should be telling that difficult history. And I thought it would be important for us to modernize the exhibit that we already had on lynching, because there was an exhibit here in the museum about lynching. But we wanted to tell a more full story, and because the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project had done the soil ceremonies, that was going to be a cornerstone of the work of this particular, or of the exhibit. And we wanted to acknowledge the work of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project and acknowledge what yet needed to happen. Because as we've talked about, memory is wonderful, it's important. But memory for what purpose? For us to figure out what the next steps are. So as we came together, and we came together in a pretty large group. Now I see Nick back there. And the first group was really big. And that conversation went all over Maryland, DC, Virginia. I mean, it was everywhere. There was a little bit of everything. And we said, okay, we gathered a lot of information. Now it's time to kind of cut this down. So we started with a large group, took in a lot of information, and came up with a smaller group that stuck together to actually develop out the exhibit. The process of securing funding was that I was actually contacted by some folks at the federal government and said, look, they're going to have some appropriations back in the budget. Is there something you want to do? And I thought, yes, this is where we get the money from. And so I wrote up this proposal for us to secure funding, and we were granted $650,000 from Senator Van Hollen, Senator Cardin, and Congressman Mfume to do an exhibit as well as a public memorial. The exhibit is done. The memorial is not yet done. But here's one of the things that you need to know about an appropriation. They appropriated $650,000. They did not give us $650,000. We spent the money, and then they reimbursed it. Now, here's the good news. The federal government is fast when it reimburses people. The state government is like slow as forever. So they were really quick when we would actually disperse money. So we did an RFP process and solicited exhibit designers to actually develop this exhibit, come up with the look, the feel of the exhibit through the conversations that we had in our group. I think we received somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 or 5 designers that responded. And we came down to 2. We ended up selecting an organization called Quatrefoil because we felt that they really understood what it was that we were trying to do. And one of the things that I think came out, and they just talked about it in this panel, was that the focus, as we discussed it in our working group, was not to be on those who were lynched. It was to focus on the people who did the perpetrating. Because we knew that everybody knew that people were lynched, but nobody was looking at the crowds. No one was looking at the people who were doing the deed. So in fact, when you see the exhibit in the video, there are images of lynchings that start with the person, you see the person lynched, and then it fades the person out so that you are left with the image of the crowd. So I can't remember what the initial date was that we said it was going to be finished. Was it in 23 initially, or was it always 24? You can't remember either. See, it's been so long, but we did initially think that we would be completed in 24 in August, but it took a little longer because there was a lot of sausage making. And collaboration is messy. It's very messy. It's not easy. You're bringing together, it's like a marriage. You're bringing together 2 families. And 2 families, they do stuff differently. And some things kind of, okay, we can get along with this, but oh no, we are not going through this. So I found myself in the role of peacemaker many times, of saying, okay, well, let me go back and talk to the group and figure out how we can move forward. The issue is, or was, that there is so much information. The Maryland Lynching Memorial Project has gathered so much information, but we didn't want an encyclopedia on the wall. We wanted an exhibit. And so to be able to take all of this, condense it down to this, to ensure that people were getting the story and were left, frankly, wanting more, to go to the archive that MLMP has come up with and do some more research on it. So that was a big part of what we were trying to do. Developing the narrative, the graphics, the video, and identifying the space. Even though it was sometimes difficult, it was fun because we knew that it was going to be a beautiful exhibit in the long run, that all of this work, all of this research, all of the community involvement and work that had gone on was going to be readily available for people to see through this exhibit. And one of the things that I think about when I think of things like exhibits or storytelling is that art will always break through the crack in the cement in struggle, no matter what. It can be the worst thing ever. I saw a story about what's going on in Palestine and how art is coming up. It is being created because it just does that. And so the same thing has happened with this lynching memorial project in that we've gotten art that has just kind of seeped up through the cracks in the concrete. The easiest issue of all as we were working through this project was that we always knew that we wanted to tell the true story. And that was consistent throughout the entire process. What it looked like, how the story was told, there were variations in that, but ultimately it was to make sure that when people left, they left with the truth. And that they knew that Maryland was not absolved from what occurred in the Deep South. That in fact, we were a part of the ugliness that was that period of time. And we knew that we wanted to be sensitive to the people who frankly had been traumatized initially, to ensure that they were not re-traumatized. At the same time, it's really hard to talk about lynching and not talk about the really dirty stuff. So I have to say, I think the committee actually moved me farther along on the idea of there are some difficult images that we have to show. We can't not show it. We have to make sure that people get that information and know what this is about. I think ultimately we have come up with an exhibit that we can all be proud of. I think the work that is yet to be done is around interpreting that exhibit for people who come into the museum. Initially, I was saying, well, we need to interpret it for young people. Nope, we need to interpret it for all people, because I'm not sure everyone understands what they're seeing when they walk into the space. So that is the work that has to still be done as far as I'm concerned with the exhibit. But I hope that each and every one of you will take the time to see the exhibit. But I also hope that you will take away from this that even though there were some tensions and some tough conversations, that when you put more and more together, you get more. You get more. And because we were able to work together, I think what we have, the product that we have, is a premier product. It's not EJI's museum, and we didn't want that. We didn't want EJI's museum. We didn't want the Civil Rights Institute from Atlanta. We didn't want the Jackson, Mississippi Museum's exhibit. We wanted Maryland's exhibit, and I think we got that. I think we got it done very well. I think it is impressive, and it also allows you to tell us what you think about it, because you can leave your thoughts at the end of the exhibit. So I hope you will take the time to really absorb it. Thank you for involving us in the process of being able to develop this exhibit, which was built in a way that's modular, so that when we renovate that third floor, we can move it to wherever we want to have it up there on the floor. So that's it. I'm not talking anymore. I'm giving you back to your time.
So thank you all so very much for hanging in there. I want to especially thank our volunteers who helped today. I want to thank the board for all of its support. Especially, I have to point out the work of Amy Millen, who just, without whom this House of Cards would completely fall apart. I can't say how much she means to us. I have to thank my sister and my wife, who had the generosity and love, and which allowed me to embark on this 6 years ago. And I know I wouldn't be here without them, and I appreciate that. And I just want to end with a story I remember telling at the first conference, where I used to, well, I guess I still do, make television shows. And I was doing a show for Discovery years ago, and it was about the mission to get to Mars, and it was like so ambitious. It was so convoluted. If you did a project flow chart or something, it would go all off the paper. It would wind around the block. It was just, it goes generations, and it's so complicated. And remember one of the scientists who is involved in it likening this to building a cathedral. Right? It took generations to build a cathedral, and the people who worked on it, they knew that they weren't going to live to see it completed, but they believed in the beauty, and in the value, and in the timeless importance of what they were doing. And I kind of feel that this fight for racial justice, this battle, this war that we were doing, that's our cathedral. And so I want to thank you all so very much for doing your part to build the cathedral. And thank you again for coming.